This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello. This is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine. A very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. And just as a treat, I'm going to look in the budget pot. I'm going to see if I can afford to use the entirety of this piece of music for the start of my podcast, or will I have to use my usual theme tune? Here's the quote. Let me just open it. Oh, come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. It's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films that I tend to choose for this podcast, they have more of a mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree as well. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. I just try to celebrate the fact it's really hard to make a film. And it's a salute, really, to the productions that did make it to the finish line. This episode, I'm delighted to say, is sponsored once again by the wonderful folks at cinemaparadiso.co.uk. If you've not heard of them, well, I'm a physical media nerd, and Cinema Paradiso is the UK's largest Blu-ray, 4K and DVD rental service. They send out physical discs to you via Royal Mail with subscription packages starting from $5.99 a month. Over 100,000 titles, loads of films you won't find on streaming services as well. But yeah, physical media. Can't beat physical media. If you make it to the midway point of the podcast, if I've not bored you by then, I'll have a code so you can have a 30-day free trial as well. Bonus. Without further ado, though, I'm going to crack on with the first of the two movies I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I think you might have guessed what it is from the opening title, that or the description that tends to come with a podcast download, but let's gloss over that. I'm going to play you a clip anyway. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Lex Luthor.
This is kind of a little reunion, isn't it? Heck, I'm a fan.
I'll have advanced technology.
Thousands of years beyond what anyone could throw at me.
But millions of people will die.
Billions!
You wrote that the world doesn't need a savior, but every day I hear people crying for one.
Come on, let me hear you say it just once.
You're insane.
No! No, the other thing.
Superman will
That then was a clip from 2006's Superman Returns, directed by Bryan Singer, screenplay by Michael Dougherty and Dan Harris, working from a story by the pair of them and Singer himself, based on Superman, of course, by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, starring Brandon Routh, Kate Bosworth, James Marsden, Frank Langella, Parker Posey, Cal Penn and Kevin Spacey, all in the ensemble for this one. Now, Superman Returns, I've just said, it would come out in cinemas in 2006. But it would be a hell of a journey to get there, because Superman had been away from the big screen since 1987. In the intervening period, Warner Brothers had an awful lot of success with Batman films, and it was in 1993, as Batman and Batman Returns made reasonable amounts of cash, that would be fair to say for the studio, that Warner's got the rights back to make Superman movies from producer Alexander Salkind. So strap in, this one takes some time. We've got much to get through, and also also, I should acknowledge from the off, going to be talking about a couple of people, three names come up who are pretty much persona non grata in Hollywood at the moment. The people concerned are Brett Ratner, Bryan Singer and Kevin Spacey, all of whom have allegations against them that they have denied, but nonetheless, or not commented on, but nonetheless, I want to be upfront about that and not dance around that subject. So let's go through a whistle-stop tour of the various attempts from 1993 by Warner Brothers to get this going right up to the Superman Returns story. So infamously, Kevin Smith was hired to write a screenplay. He's talked about this I think it's on the First Evening with Kevin Smith DVD, which is well worth digging out because the story is just incredible. He was working for legendary producer and former hairdresser John Peters. Peters came at the film with certain demands. He wanted Superman wearing a black suit. He wanted at one stage a fight with a polar bear. He wanted a finale fight with a mechanical spider as well for Smith to write into the script. Unrelated, Peters would also produce the film Wild Wild West, just leaving that there. Assorted villains, mooted Brainiac was the one who was looking like it was going to be the foe that Superman would be fighting against. Sean Penn mentioned at that point as a possible Superman, but then out went Kevin Smith. In came Tim Burton. He sent the screenplay back to square one, didn't want to work with Smith's script. So this is where the project became Superman Lives. And the tale of this one is told in a feature documentary by the late John Schnepp, which I really recommend, called The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened. In that, you see test footage of Nicolas Cage in a particularly stylized Superman suit. And it tells the story of the cancelled movie. Bottom line, the price of Tim Burton's take on Superman was going to be in the region of $200 million. And Warner Brothers got cold feet. It didn't help that by this point, we're heading to the end of the 1990s, Batman and Robin had spluttered, so the Batman saga on the big screen was struggling. X-Men hadn't come out just at that point to give comic book movies a huge shot in the arm, but that was coming very, very shortly. So out went Tim Burton. In came an offer to the director McG. He was riding half the back of the first Charlie's Angels film. But McG was committed to making the second Charlie's Angels film, Charlie's Angels Full Throttle. So when McG said no, in came Brett Ratner. Ratner wanted to cast Josh Hartnett at one point. Hartnett was reportedly offered a huge deal that would have covered 3 pictures to play the Man of Steel, would have made him a very rich man. He turned that deal down. Ratner offered Matt Bomer as a choice of Superman as well. And as Empire magazine described in its July 1996 issue, Ratner also called Bryan Singer, who was at that point riding high with the first 2 X-Men movies. They had a phone conversation in February 2003 to see, and Ratner was looking really for recommendations for a second unit director for the Superman film. Singer gave 1 or 2 names, and at this point, Ratner would, the one piece of casting he was said to have in place, and I'm grateful to Jake Rosson's excellent book Superman vs. Hollywood for this, was Anthony Hopkins. He'd asked him if he would play the character of Jor-El, Superman's father. Ratner and Hopkins had worked together on the remake of Manhunter that went based on Thomas Harris's book Red Dragon, the Hannibal Lecter movie. But then the budget started ballooning and the director left again. And this left Warner Brothers, crucially, without a big franchise movie as well for the summer of 2004. And 2005 was looking shaky, although Batman Begins would fill that gap in 2005. But the absence of Superman was said to be what fast-tracked Warner Brothers' decision to go with a standalone Catwoman movie. That went well. So Ratner was out. M. Night Shyamalan was considered at this point as well. That a conversation was had with him. Does he want to come in and make a Superman movie? Someone must want to make one. But he was not keen because he basically wanted to write it all himself and didn't want to use the existing materials that were there. Because by this stage, there were a couple of competing scripts, and the one that had bubbled up was by J.J. Abrams, who got the gig in part off the back of his work on the TV show Alias. And it's a pretty well-known story that also, alongside it, Warner Brothers had been developing the idea of a Batman vs. Superman movie, which would have been directed by Wolfgang Peterson. And it got to the point where Warner Brothers hierarchy had to choose which was it going to go with. And the script that most endeared itself to the bosses of Warner Brothers was the one by Abrams. As a result, Batman vs. Superman was put into turnaround. Wonder what happened to that idea. And Wolfgang Petersen got the green light to go off and make Troy instead, almost as a consolation prize, really. So the Abrams script was the incumbent one. Shyamalan didn't want to make that one. And so once again, Warner Brothers, I mean, it had bits and bobs of this, but who was it going to get to direct the film? Well, by this stage, so much time had gone that McG had finished making Charlie's Angels Full Throttle. And so an offer went back in to him to see if he wanted to do it. And he got as far as shooting test footage with a variety of potential candidates, Jason Behr, Henry Cavill, at that point, Jared Padalecki. There were a bunch of people who were auditioning to play Superman, to step into the tights made famous on the big screen by the late, great Christopher Reeve. But familiar problems were bubbling up. Now, the OC creator Josh Schwartz had come in to do a pass on the script as well, just to beef it up. But Warner Brothers was getting really, really antsy about the cost of this project because, again, it was going above $200 million, an awful lot of money. And at this point, comic book movies, X-Men and X2 had done particularly well, but these weren't the bright comic book movies of the 80s. They were starting to take a darker edge. And could Superman really fit into that? Don't forget too that the style of the Batman reboot that Christopher Nolan was working on, that was very, very, very dark as well. But what ultimately led to McG and Warner Brothers parting company wasn't just the budget, it was the location. As Variety reported at the time, that one of the things Warner Brothers wanted to do was to shoot what would become Superman Returns, although at that point was still Superman Flyby, in Australia to save money. McG wanted to film it in Canada, and there's a story that he has a phobia of flying over water, and the thought of going off to Australia to shoot the film, that was enough to be a deal breaker for him, and he did indeed, over either the money or the location or both, walk away from the film. So here we were again, and Warner Brothers was in trouble. We're coming up to 2004, and it had been trying for, at this stage, over a decade to get a film going, and not in a kind of passive way. It spent, by various estimates, $50-60 million to get this far. I mean, Nicolas Cage was said to have a pay-or-play deal for when he signed up to play Superman, which meant he got his paycheck, and not a small one, whether his film went ahead or not. So he got an awful lot of money for walking around in a posh suit, really. But then it came back to Bryan Singer, who was actually developing at that stage a project with Warner Brothers. That the second X-Men film in particular had been hugely acclaimed and had been a big hit for 20th Century Fox, and the X-Men films really were given the credit for reigniting the comic book movie boom. And so he was talking with Warner Brothers about doing a remake of Logan's Run. He'd also got a development deal at 20th Century Fox. He was set to make the third X-Men film. He was the incumbent there, and he wanted to do that film. But he went into Warner Brothers to have his meeting about Logan's Run. 72 hours later, he dropped that project, and he was doing Superman because he had a conversation with Alan Horn, who was then in charge of getting this film moving at Warner Brothers, now at Disney. And he put it to Warner Brothers that the problem you've got is you keep trying to reinvent the legend. Don't reinvent the legend. Instead, build on the legend. Have a story about Superman being away from Earth and then coming back after a period of time. Make it a sequel as such to the two Richard Donner films that Singer and many of us really, really loved, appreciating that Richard Lester finished Superman 2. There is still Richard Donner is pretty well known, shot the majority of it. So the idea was to basically make it a sort of Superman 3, and this really, at this point, Warner Brothers wanted an answer to the problem. Batman was moving, Catwoman was moving, Green Lantern was in early talks as well. Why couldn't anyone get a Superman film going? Here in front of them was a successful director who got a proven track record of marshalling comic book films as well, who had a take on Superman that was palatable to the studio. And in July 2004, thus came the official announcement. Bryan Singer was indeed to direct what would become Superman Returns. Now, what didn't happen instantly was him dropping out of making X-Men The Last Stand, but that would follow just a couple of weeks later, and he would ultimately say he'd regret making that decision, that he should have stuck with X-Men and followed that through, easy in hindsight. But it's also, Singer had just signed that development deal with Fox as well, but he went with Warner Brothers' offer, and that also meant that his Logan's Run film was going to have to be delayed, and X-Men thus went to, yes, Brett Ratner. perfect. Singer then brought with him a new take on the Superman revival, one that would junk the work that had been done to date, not for the first time. And the week the news of the announcement of his appointment landed, Catwoman was just about to open, so lots of excitement over that. Nolan was shooting Batman Begins with Christian Bale as the Dark Knight. And here we had Singer, who was going into a Superman project hugely influenced by Richard Donner's original movie. Now, as Jeff Robinov, who was Warner Brothers president of production in 2006, said, at the point McG basically walked away from the film, he said the smart thing would have been to let everything cool down and spend some time figuring out what to do next. But then we heard Brian's pitch and we were finally in business. So what Singer did is he brought with him his X-Men co-writers, Michael Dougherty and Dan Harris, and they fashioned a script that would pick up the story from after Superman 2, effectively. John Peters was still somewhere around, but he wasn't having much in the way of creative involvement at this point. By the time the film came out, he pretty much had no creative involvement. The J.J. Abrams script that killed Batman vs. Superman, that was gone. And instead, what Dougherty and Harris did is they went back to square one and they focused on finding the character and getting that right rather than the dense plots that had been developed. But the clock was ticking because Warner Brothers still wanted this film, and it had a path now to getting this movie out in 2006 as its big blockbuster for 2006. That gave this team 2 years to basically get the film made. They had 4 weeks to deliver their first draft of the script. Now, before he signed on the dotted line, Singer did go out of his way to seek the blessing of Richard Donner, and none of the others who'd been involved in the project at that point had done that. Donner, in turn, gave him access to unused Marlon Brando material from the original Superman, and this is Empire in July 2006 who gave me this information. And so that material would ultimately be used in the final cut. And as Entertainment Weekly said of Dougherty, Harris and Singer's story ideas, just like the trio envisioned a rich, romantic, biblical-feeling epic. Their plot would have a typically over-the-top Lex Luthor real estate swindle, this time using the mysteriously powerful crystals in Superman's Fortress of Solitude to engineer the deadliest land grab known to man. And so they decided very, very early on, the creative team, that it was going to be Kevin Spacey and Parker Posey, the people they needed for the villains. Now, Kevin Spacey at this point wasn't actively looking for a villain role. He wasn't looking for much in the way of movie roles, given his commitment to the Old Vic Theatre in London at the time, but he'd worked with Singer before on The Usual Suspects. He quickly agreed to shave his head and play Lex Luthor if he could fit it in between his theatre commitments in London. The Parker Posey, brilliant Parker Posey, also signed on the dotted line. Kate Bosworth was found to take on the role of Lois Lane, but of course all the speculation was on who's going to play Clark Kent, who's going to play Superman. And this again went back to the ethos of those original films, because Singer wanted an unknown. He wanted the idea to go back to just that spirit of introducing Christopher Reeve to a mainstream audience through Superman. And so this is where Brandon Routh came back into the process. Now, he'd already been rejected by this point. His photo had gone through the pile that Brett Ratner had sorted through. McG actually had him at one point in his top 5 choices for the role, but then when McG departed the project, Brandon Routh heard nothing, didn't get a note or anything, and he was just left surfing through internet news websites to pick up whatever information he could. A very reliable way to get your news, I'd suggest. But Singer basically went through all the people who'd been on the list before, spotted Brandon Routh, who at that point was only really known for soap opera work, and the pair met for a coffee, just a meeting really in a cafe rather than anything particularly formal, and they chatted for a couple of hours, and Singer felt that he had his Superman. So he saw the resemblance to Christopher Reeve as well, which, given the direction the film was going, that was a real bonus. Brandon Routh would then have to still shoot a screen test, which he duly did, but in October 2004 he was announced. He was the new Superman. At the same point in October 2004, Kevin Spacey's casting was confirmed as well. Singer around the same time was involved with the television series House that was just starting out. It was a very busy time, but all of a sudden it looked like Warner Brothers had its ducks in order. So the schedule was in place that it would have a Batman reboot for 2005, it would have a Superman film for 2006. Catwoman hadn't gone too well, but nonetheless, the two biggest comic book properties on its asset book were coming back to the big screen. Now, the cost was still going to be on the high side. The budget ultimately that was agreed before filming began was $185 million. During production, though, Warner Brothers would strike a deal with Legendary Entertainment to halve the costs and also halve the returns of the movie, just because the cost of this one continued to go up. In fact, Singer had to do fairly late cuts to the film in order to get the budget down to $185 million because it had ballooned again. One of the things that went was some huge physical set building work, and instead they used digital effects just to extend some of the sets instead. But by February 2005, nearly 20 years after the last Superman film had begun shooting, another one was pressing forward. Superman Returns got underway in Australia. It was a taxing physical shoot as well. I mean, Brandon Ruth inevitably would bear a lot of the brunt of it. He'd go through about 50, 60 different suits throughout the making of the film. He would actually get the blessing of the late Dana Reeve, Christopher Reeve's widow, who herself would pass away before the film was completed. But also, from a technical point of view, this was the first major blockbuster to use a new camera system from Panavision, the Genesis camera. And the idea there was, I mean, digital production had been moving forward quite a lot. I mean, George Lucas at this point had filmed his Star Wars prequel trilogy with digital cameras, but they're technologically nowhere near as advanced as they are now, but they were up to the majority of the job of filming a new Superman film. That at Studio Daily there's an interesting piece where they talk about the contrast on them was very good, not as good as physical film, but the colours were very rich. They still had to switch to using film for very fast shots. The technology of the camera was evolving as they went along, that it would start with a capability of 24 frames per second, and then it was up to 30 frames per second by the end. But also, this was a fairly nascent technology in terms of what it was being put to use for here. The camera just kept stopping working at times as well. It particularly didn't like damp conditions, and going spoiler light on this one, let's just say, given where the finale goes, having a camera that's not particularly good when it's wet, that you could understand that would be a problem. Ruth was enduring the pain of us believing a man could fly. The flying harnesses that he wore, I don't think anyone's particularly ever enjoyed wearing those. He had to have a codpiece. He had to wear a codpiece as well that would ensure a PG certificate. I think I've put that quite delicately. And Ruth would tell Empire that a lot of the shoot was pretty much a study in pain endurance. Even as the film was shooting, the first costume shot was causing, let's just say, internet debate. That internet chatter was fueled even more when Singer, in the middle of production, went back to the US for San Diego Comic-Con in July 2005 to present 5 minutes of footage from the movie. Went down really well, though. Batman Begins by this point had come out. That had gone down really well. Lots of enthusiasm. A lot of the fan chatter in the end was about the size of the S on Superman's costume, and if the debate is down to that, they kind of figured, well, they're not on too bad a thing here. There aren't that many huge action sequences in Superman Returns. I think that's pretty well known. But there is one that involves a jet plane and a sports field. And this was a really complicated shot to do. This main action sequence was shot and reshot. And Entertainment Weekly report said complications with the green screen work reached a crisis late in production during the shooting of the film's apocalyptic climax inside 3 massive water tanks. It got to the point where Singer was just physically exhausted. The cast and crew were physically exhausted, and they asked for a 3-week shutdown to reassess it all and just have a bit of a downtime, really, which Warner Brothers agreed to. But all the while, the budget was going up again. It was back over $200 million. In fact, by the end, some would say $250 million. It's not my money, so I don't have the exact amount. Also, if you account with all the development costs put on top beforehand that had got it to this point, I mean, I dread to think your eyes just water. There were extra effects. There was addition of a bank robbery sequence and a particular eyeball and bullet moment that was put in that wasn't in the original script, but that was put in because they needed a really big trailer moment as much as anything else. But the success of Batman Begins was also putting the pressure on this one, because as the cost balloons and as Batman had shown a way of going darker and bringing in box office returns, well, the feeling was Superman Returns was going to need to make $600 million at the global box office, more than Batman Begins, just to break even. By the autumn of 2005, the film then was heading to post-production, filming wrapped up, but heck, there was still an awful lot to do. Now, fan interest was being stoked right throughout this, it should be noted. That video diaries were produced throughout the production as well. That social media wasn't a thing at this point, but following the progress of a film online, well, that certainly was. The first trailer came out on November the 17th, 2005, and that's some 7-8 months before the film itself, and the enthusiasm was just stoked up. Singer, though, even up against a July release date, the film wouldn't be locked down until gone April 2006. The score from John Ottman, and he used cues from John Williams, as you heard right at the start. That was one of the last things to go in. That took a lot of work. The editing itself took place at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, and Singer, though, he didn't want test screenings for this one. Instead, he had almost a brain trust of people that he would show his cut of the film to. Nonetheless, when it came to present the final version of Superman Returns, it was at a bomb sweltering 154 minutes. You were going to need cushions for this one, and whilst there was a feeling that the film justified it, especially going back to the kind of biblical epic thing that they were going for right at the start, that was still another part of the gamble here. Not that Warner Brothers was shy of confidence. It had already greenlit Batman Begins 2, which would turn into The Dark Knight, of course. But months before Superman Returns made it into cinemas, well, it had announced Superman Returns 2 as well. Full confidence here, full steam ahead. Mid-2009, Superman Returns 2 was going to be in cinemas. Bryan Singer was going to direct again. Logan's Run, that would have to be pushed back again. It'd be Brainiac in as the villain for Superman Returns 2. There would be the picking up the thread from Superman Returns involving a child. But whilst the initial critical response for Superman Returns, when it finally landed in cinemas in the US on June the 28th, 2006, was pretty good, it wasn't at Batman level. And once that first wave of enthusiasm had gone, well, the criticism really came to the fore quite a lot, that this was a downbeat 2.5-hour blockbuster. There wasn't much Superman being Superman. There wasn't much in the way of action. In fact, Singer would say of the sequel that he'd go all Wrath of Khan on it, in a nod to the fact that the action quotient would need to be upped for the second movie. And the tone of it was, I think it's fair to say, it was a surprise. I've always been quite fond of Superman Returns, but in its earnestness and the effort really to capture what Richard Donner had got, it falls into one or two traps, I would suggest. Still, the initial audience response in terms of box office, well, that was strong. That it opened the long weekend of June the 30th to July the 4th in the US, and over that period, it would gross $108 million. It would open at number 1. The Devil Wears Prada at number 2 with a surprisingly strong 40 million. I really like that film. Click, the Adam Sandler movie, it was riding high as well. That was in 3rd place. Pixar's Cars, Nacho Libre with Jack Black, The Lake House, Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift. That was an interesting film, should come to at this point. But also, by this point, X-Men The Last Stand had come out, and that had pretty much cleaned up for a long time. That was the biggest grossing X-Men movie, and by the time Superman Returns headed to US cinemas, it had grossed $229 million itself, that third X-Men film. Superman Returns would peter out at the US box office at $200 million and overseas at $191. So the overall gross for this film would come in at $391 million. And Warner Brothers wasn't happy. That wasn't enough. That it was okay by 2006 standards. The era of the regular billion-dollar blockbuster was still some way away. But Warner Brothers publicly said it wasn't good enough. Jeff Robinov would tell the Wall Street Journal in 2008 that Superman didn't quite work as a film in the way we wanted it to. It didn't position the character the way he needed to be positioned. Had Superman worked in 2006, he said, we would have had a movie for Christmas of this year, as as in 2008 or 2009, but the plan is just to reintroduce Superman without regard to a Batman and Superman movie at all. And that's what he was saying in 2008. Singer was apparently not happy with this at all. And in fact, as discussions about the sequel wore on, he went off to go and make Valkyrie with Tom Cruise instead. The writing team of Dougherty and Harris, they moved on as well. And it was still Singer's project, in theory, the next Superman movie. He was certainly asked about it a lot on the press tour for Valkyrie. But when he went off to do Jack the Giant Killer instead as his next film, well, that was that. That Warner Brothers had decided that Batman was safe in Nolan's hands. I mean, it clearly was as well. But the plan ultimately would migrate to, let's have just a completely different run at Superman, a feeling that Superman Returns hadn't really worked and they needed to go back to square one. And it was Christopher Nolan who came up with an approach for what would become the film Man of Steel, which was the next time we'd see Superman on the big screen. And the call went into Zack Snyder, and that would change the direction of DC's comic book movies. Again, lots of stories there for another time. I did just want to focus though on the fact that Brandon Routh, in the midst of it all, he entirely deserved the acclaim he got for realising the Man of Steel on the big screen, and he would ultimately get the chance to play Superman again on the small screen. Without Superman Returns, Warner Brothers, though, it pursued instead, as well as The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, it pursued a film called Green Lantern, but then that too is a story for another time. Which all brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Just giving another shout out to my sponsors, cinemaparadiso.co.uk. If you use the code FSTORIES at their website and you sign up, you can have a 30-day free trial. So lots of physical media to rent for free for a month. And I hugely encourage you to do that, not just because it supports this podcast and supports us giving new writers opportunities on our website as well and helping giving them a break in, but also you get yourself a load of really good films to watch. This podcast is an independent. I go on about this quite a lot. I'm hugely grateful for your support and for the fact that your word of mouth has got me this far. I don't have a big publishing company. I do have a new microphone this week. The other one was breaking a little bit. Hopefully it sounds okay. If you can leave ideally a hugely positive review at your podcast repository of choice, I'd be hugely obliged. Likewise, if you could subscribe to this podcast too. Also, we're at Patreon if you want to support this podcast. Patreon.com/Simon Brew, and the latest issues of our print magazines, Film Stories and Film Stories Junior. One has just gone on sale, the other is just about to go on sale. You can find out more about those at store.filmstories.co.uk. Now that I'm going to press on with the second of the two stories I'm going to talk about in this episode, I'm coming to a far more recent film now. I'll play you a clip. I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
You cannot be serious, mate.
My dream was to come here and work hard for my family.
If you don't try to fix this, we will lose our son for good.
This guy is incredible. You've never heard lyrics like his. Is that Billy Joel?
Billy Joel? You try and raise your kids right, Jane.
Bruce sings about not letting the hardness of the world stop you from letting the best of you slip away. My hope is to build a bridge to my ambitions, but not a wall between my family and me.
That then is a clip from 2019's delightful Blinded by the Light, directed by Gurinder Chadha, written by Paul Mayeda-Berger, Gurinder Chadha and Safraz Manzoor, based on his memoir Greetings from Berry Park, Race, Religion and Rock and Roll. Cast for this one led by Vivek Kalra, Kulvinder Gill, Meera Ganatra, Nell Williams, Aaron Pagura and Dean Charles Chapman. The film too is based on around the music of Bruce Springsteen, who at the point this is being recorded is in the news over a drink driving offence actually. The story of this particular film though would go back to the youth of initially Safraz Manzoor. Just like Gurinder Chadha, he grew up as a huge fan of the music of Bruce Springsteen. Chadha was working, she had a Saturday job and the music kept playing. That's how she got into it. But Safraz Manzoor, well, a complete mega fan. Seen him in concert over 150 times I've read, to the point where Springsteen easily recognises him him. And he talks in his book about being a young boy of Pakistani heritage, growing up in the 70s. And as the synopsis to the book says, his teenage years were a constant battle to reconcile being both British and Muslim. While he was growing up in his teenage years, his best friend introduced him to the music of Bruce Springsteen, and a lifelong love affair duly sprung up. Now, Mansour has built up a really strong career as a journalist, as a broadcaster, as documentary maker, and he published his memoir, Greetings from Berry Park, in 2018, I think, and it was the story of him growing up, of his late father, of his love of Springsteen. Now, separately, Gurinder Chadha had, in the late 80s, early 90s, she'd been building up her own career, initially working with the BBC as a journalist. She was on BBC Radio WM, which is a local radio station to where I am, doing weather reports and things like that. She was then making short films and documentaries with the BBC, but her first feature came in 1993's Bargee on the Beach, that she and Mira Sayal, the brilliant Mira Sayal, came up with. They came up with the story for it. Sayal wrote the screenplay, Chadha directed, and the film cut through. It wasn't a huge hit or anything, but it was certainly a notable British movie of an ilk that just wasn't being made at this point. I think it's a really delightful film as well. Opportunities hardly came flooding in the aftermath of it, but it was 2002's Bend It Like Beckham for Gurinder Chadha that really put her on the map as a film director. A hugely surprising hit. Again, a really delightful film. I've covered it on a previous episode of the podcast, and she would go on to make films such as Bride and Prejudice, Angus Thongs and Perfect Snogging as well, and in 2010 she released the film It's a Wonderful Afterlife. Now, Chadha had read Safran Mansour's book and really loved it, and invited him along to come to a very special event with her in 2010. And this was arguably the pivotal moment of turning Greetings from Berry Park into the film Blinded by the Light, because in 2010, a Bruce Springsteen documentary by the name of The Promise was coming out. There was a red carpet premiere taking place in London. Chadha had an invite. She invited Mansour along, and on the as he walked down the red carpet, Springsteen saw Safran Mansour and told him he was a fan of the book and how he'd found it really touching. Particularly gobsmacking that must be for someone who was and is such a fan of him. Chadha seized the moment and said to Bruce Springsteen there and then, she directed Bend It Like Beckham. She wanted to make that book into a film. Would he be interested? Springsteen stopped, thought about it, said, sounds good, talk to John. That would be John Lando, his producer, and the project suddenly had a spark to it and was very slowly moving forward, because there was still nearly a decade to go of this particular story. Because small little things, they had to write a screenplay, turning the book into a 3-act feature film, one that would find an audience and have some commercial appeal as well. It was going to be tricky. But it's also, Mansour at this point had written lots and lots of things, hugely accomplished writer, but had never done a screenplay. Now Chadha had, and so she describes how there were lots and lots of sessions at her house just to start getting this down on paper, really. And then once Mansour had come up with a screenplay, she brought in her regular writing partner, Paul Meyer de Berger, and the pair of them finished the script off. They put the structure into it, and they had a project that, well, it was in a position to go forward. There was still toing and froing though, because as the script evolved, it was, well, what do you do with Bruce Springsteen's music in this? Do you make this a jukebox musical? Well, no, really. That was decided fairly early on that they didn't want to do that, but as the script evolved more and more, they weaved more and more of his music into it. And in fact, the final style of the film, I mean, it walks a tightrope, and some people say more successfully than others. I really like the film, that there's one or two bits where it perhaps goes a bit jukeboxy, there's one or two bits where it goes where it weaves the songs in more organically. Nonetheless, it was core that Springsteen's music was a big part of this story. Now, in the midst of all of this, Springsteen was being kept up to date with how the project was going. The go-between between the filmmakers and Springsteen was Tracy Nurse. She's a marketing and PR consultant who's worked with Springsteen for an awful long time, and he basically had to give the blessing for the use of his music in the film, which he duly gave. It was, and that was a big thing as well, because Springsteen's music, whilst he'd won an Oscar for his song "Streets of Philadelphia" for the Academy Award-winning film, obviously Philadelphia, his music hadn't been used extensively in feature films, so it was actually a big deal, really, that he gave permission for this film to use it so extensively. It got to the point that they were happy with the script, that the British Film Institute had come in and given some development funding for it. Chadder's Bendit Films was involved. Other film companies, Ingenious Media and Levantine Films, were coming together to provide the network, really, of companies that would get this to the start of production. And that meant it was time to start thinking about casting the film. Now, the core role at the heart of this is Javed, who's effectively Safran Manzoor, and Chadder narrowed down. One thing that's worth noting in particular on Chadder's films is how good she is at breaking and finding new talent. You look at Bend It Like Beckham, Parminder Nagra and Keira Knightley getting big breaks in that. Angus Thongs and Perfect Snogging, Aaron Taylor-Johnson, he got a break in that. And here she was again in a film that really is a companion piece to a degree to Bend It Like Beckham, she'd say, looking for a fresh young cast again. Now, she narrowed the shortlist for the role of Javed down to 3 people, and as it turned out, 2 of them are in the film, because for a while Aaron Fagura was her choice to take on that role, but she decided in the end to cast him in the role of Roops, the best friend of Javed in the movie, and the 2 of them form quite a combination throughout the film as well. Instead, it'd be Vivek Kalra who would take on the lead role, and then the ensemble, also Nell Williams, another newcomer brought in another pivotal role in the movie, and then she would cast around she would cast around these newcomers, the likes of Kulvinder Gier, who she'd worked with on Bend It Like Beckham, Nikita Mehta as Shazia, Meera Ganatra as Javed's mum, Rob Brydon, a huge Springsteen fan, Sally Phillips, Marcus Brigstock and Hayley Atwell. They all came together in the ensemble, and at the point that the film was announced in April of 2018, Entertainment One had picked up the UK and Australian distribution rights, and the plan was then to sell the rest of the rights at the Cannes Film Festival that was just around the corner. Filming then could begin. They were at that point in April of 2018, and it was crucial, given that this is a story set in 1980s Britain in the Luton area, that they filmed in the Luton area, that they made this a location-driven film. When I interviewed Chadder about this movie, one of the things I pointed out to her is she seems to have quite a fondness of putting the British motorway network on the big screen, and here she does it again. If you want a good big screen look at the M1, this is the movie for you. The movie would shoot in Luton, in the home counties area. There was a bit of location work done in the US as well. For the lead, though, Vivek Kalra had to get time off from college to make the film. And as it turned out, he didn't even tell his parents he got the gig at this point. His parents were fans of Chadder's movies. But one of the huge advantages to Chadder working with him was the fact that he was a completely new talent, and the 2 of them could work together to mould the performance that he would put in for the role of Javed. And she speaks to the joy of working with new talent, breaking new talent through. And the fact is that for Kalra, this is a really substantive role. He's on screen for an enormous amount of the film. He was always going to be on screen for a lot of it in the lead role, but a really sizable. If you go back and watch it, if you've not watched it before, I'd keep a lookout on the second time. If you go back and watch it, he's in it a lot, and it was Chadder and Kalra who were the ones who were on set every day throughout the shoot. I think they were the only ones who were. Chadder told me in the end that everyone else had at least had a day off somewhere along the line. Kulvinder Gier, I just think, is magnificent in this film as Javed's father. And in fact, he'd lost his own father just a year before the film shot. And it's a circle of emotion, really, because for Manzoor, there's an actor who is made up to look like his own father, and he's playing the role of his father. And in the meantime, the actor himself is mourning the loss of his father. And there's so much heart to the performance there, and the underlying emotion of it, I really think it's just terrific. If you can't tell, I absolutely adore this film. One of the toughest things to shoot, though, was the restaging of a National Front march that took place in Luton in the 1980s, and it was something that the extras found incredibly tough. And Gurinder Chadha needed them to put across the racism of the time, and the extras would find that, and the actors would find themselves really apologetic at having to do. As soon as Chadha said cut, she said that there would be people just saying sorry because they hated having to say some of the stuff they were having to say. The art department too, they really struggled with some of the graffiti that was required, and they just didn't want to do it. I mean, there's swastikas in the background, there's racist graffiti, and in the end, Chadha had to do some of the graffiti herself, and Kulvinder Gear helped out as well because he lived through this at the time, and so he wanted to make sure that this was documented on film. It was a really important part of history, and a really horrible part of history, but you just couldn't blink away from it. When then the film wrapped up, the challenge for Chadha intensified too, because at the same time she was working on the ITV drama Beecham House, which she was supervising the edit of, and she would talk about how she went from the edit suite of the television show to the edit suite of Blinded by the Light, and then back again, and all these two productions were in post-production at exactly the same time, and she was having to deal with them, and it was an intense period for her as well, because she was in the midst of going through an impending bereavement herself, and a really tough time all round. The film would be completed, and then completed to a point where it could be shown to Bruce Springsteen himself, and for a lifelong fan of Springsteen, this was a hugely nervous moment for Chadha, that she sat in the same screening room as he watched it for the first time. She said she sat diagonally behind him watching her film, and she talks of the relief when he laughed, and looking at the moments that he laughed at, and there were moments in it he didn't quite get. I mean, there's a day timer in the middle, which if you've seen the film you'll know what I'm on about, which was completely new to him, and he just loved it. And at the end of the film, as the credits rolled, he got up and he walked over to he saw her, he gave her a kiss on the cheek and said, "Thank you for looking after me so beautifully." And then he sat with her for an hour or so, dissecting the film, asking his questions, going through what he loved, and then also saying, well, what else do you need? Is there anything I can do to help? And at that point, the music wasn't entirely locked down. Chadha needed little bits of score, just based on his songs, just to tie some moments up, and he agreed to provide the support there as well. The film got to a point where it was ready for its first public showing, and that would be at the Sundance Film Festival at the start of 2019, and the response to it was really, really, really strong, which was useful because there was still the matter of the American rights for a start hadn't been picked up at that stage, that we knew we were going to get it in the UK at some point, but when was it going to arrive in other territories around the world? Well, a bidding war kicked off at this point, and that bidding war would ultimately be won by New Line Cinema. It's worth noting that at Sundance, Bruce Springsteen didn't go along himself because he didn't want to get in the way of the film. He felt it was their film and he didn't want to be a distraction from that. New Line Cinema would spend 15 million, something like that, to pick up the American distribution rights to the movie, New Line being part of Warner Brothers. And given that the film had cost something like $15 million to make, well, it had covered its costs at that point already. An incredible achievement, and buoyed by the strong reviews that it had, there was real confidence that this could break through. What was building, though, what the problem was lots of films that were being perceived in pretty much the same way were all coming at the same time. That films based in and around the songbooks of bands or singers were bubbling up. So Danny Boyle's film Yesterday, based in using extensively the music of the Beatles, that was due out in the UK around the same time. There's Rocket Man with the music of Elton John. Bohemian Rhapsody had cleaned up with the music of Queen. Last Christmas was going to come along with the music of George Michael. musical, and it was quite hard to get across what you were trying to do with the music and not be just simply described as the jukebox musical that many of these films were, that they'd fought quite hard not to be that, but by nature of the competition they're up against, it was quite hard not to get pulled into that kind of conversation. Nonetheless, there's still confidence with it, and rightly so, and the film had a London and a Luton premiere in the summer of 2019, and the movie opened in the UK to good reviews. It opened to okay box office as well. But the thing with the reviews, and it's an interesting contrast now looking back at it, was there was a little bit of pushback, partly about the film not entirely deciding where it wanted to lie in terms of its music, but primarily the fact that it was a feel-good film. It's unashamedly, I mean, it talks about some really difficult stuff and it doesn't shy away from things, but it was a feel-good film. There's a degree of snobbishness towards the fact that it was a feel-good film. Yet, if you fast forward a year to the middle of the pandemic in 2020, when Amazon Prime Video in the UK put Blinded by the Light on its service, the response was incredibly warm online to it. And as Chadder noted, perhaps actually we do need feel-good films that it takes away some of the cynical blinkers towards stuff like that, when you need films that can give you a lift. I should also note that Safraz Manzoor, in times when we're not locked down, does a live show where he talks about his story from the development of the novel right through to turning it into a film in his own live show, and it's worth just seeking him out on Twitter to find out when his next shows are likely to be, because that'd be quite an evening. When it came to the US release of the movie, well, there was a premiere at Asbury Park, which was attended by Chadder and Manzoor, with Springsteen stood in the middle of them, and the picture of the three of them walking down the carpet together is really quite something. But the film spluttered a bit at the US box office, and it was said that, I mean, the criticism at the time was that Warner Brothers they'd not given it a careful release, that they'd just gone for a big all-in-one release on it rather than building up its audience over a number of weeks, and that it had been caught a little bit in the aftermath of Yesterday as well, and had suffered as a result. And in fact, the global box office for the film was 18 million in the end, off a budget of 15 million, and it's only really on home formats and streaming that it's really started to find the audience that it absolutely deserves. I do want to add on the movie as well, one of the things that really appeals to me about it, not least just because I just think it really is a really uplifting film, is that there's a subset of movies, I think, where you can look at 5-6 different characters in there and just wonder what their individual stories are. I'm thinking they're so well drawn, they're so well put over on the film, that you could sit through a film just following those. And I think that of Kulvinder Gears as Javed's father. I think that as well, Shazia, played by Nikita Mehta, his sister, I think her story, which is cut a little bit short in the movie, I just think there's a film and a half in there as well. But also the story of Meera Ganatra playing Noor, Javed's mother. Just several different ways this could have gone. You can imagine the battle just to get all this down into a screenplay. Blinded by the Light continues to be available on streaming services. It is a film that's been discovered by a new audience that didn't get it at the cinema. But I'm just glad that it is. I'm glad that it's made. I'm glad that it's out there. Since then, we don't quite know which of the projects Gurinder Chadder's juggling that she's going to do next because of lockdown and the point this is being recorded. We're still in lockdown here in the UK, hopefully for not much longer. But for now, Blinded by the Light, I think, is a real triumph. And if you've not had the pleasure of it, I do recommend seeking it out. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. You can get more of my waffling if you can stand it on Twitter at Simon Brew. The entire Film Stories project is on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. Got a website updated every weekday with new features, new film stories, reviews, news, just film chat really. That's at filmstories.co.uk. You can buy all of our magazines, just 29 different issues now at store.filmstories.co.uk. Independent publishing is really under a lot of pressure at the moment, so all of your support there is hugely appreciated. We're at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, and at YouTube as well, youtube.com/filmstories. But for now, I think you'll agree I've waffled on way too long, waffled on too much, so I'm going to leave you in peace. I just want to say that the most important thing here is you all stay safe, you all stay well. I'll be back with you shortly with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all take care. Bye-bye.
He has an 80-foot tarantula.
Yes, well, I was coming to that.